Hey, 8th graders, welcome to today's Explainer. We are diving straight into the complex layers of early U.S. history. We're not just going to memorize dates and names on a map, we're going to examine the multiple, often totally colliding viewpoints that truly shaped the Americas. We are doing the real work of historians today. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start by analyzing competing perspectives, then look at the reality of conquest, dive into agency and active resistance, trace settlement, empire, and protest, and finish up with a quick recap and a final transfer question. Let's get into it. All right, Section 1, Analyzing Competing Perspectives. We're kicking things off with Christopher Columbus. After his 1492 voyage, Columbus wrote something historians call a probanza de merito. Literally, that translates to a proof of merit. Think of it basically like a highly exaggerated resume or report that he sent straight back to the Spanish crown. Why? Well, the entire design of this document was to win royal patronage. He wanted to get more funding from the king and queen for future voyages, plain and simple. And this perfectly highlights our first big lesson in historical thinking. These early primary sources, they definitely weren't objective news reports. They were packed with myths, fabrications, and serious distortions. Conquistadors purposefully wrote them to make conquering the Americas look, well, incredibly easy, super peaceful, and ridiculously profitable. So as historians, it's absolutely crucial that we learn to separate a primary source claim from the corroborated historical context. The claim usually promises overflowing wealth and totally submissive native peoples. But the corroborated context, the actual verified facts, shows us something very different. It reveals a desperate need for royal cash, the spread of devastating European diseases, and a really brutal system of forced labor. Okay, time for a quick pause check. Think about this for a second. Why on earth did European promoters write these wildly exaggerated accounts instead of just telling the absolute truth about what was actually happening across the Atlantic? Well, the immediate reasoning is actually pretty straightforward. First, they desperately needed that royal patronage and funding to keep their expeditions afloat. Second, they used these dressed-up documents to justify the very harsh realities of colonization to the folks back home. And finally, they were out to secure personal wealth, honor, and national glory in what was a crazy competitive European race for dominance. Moving right along, Section 2, the reality of conquest. When we put these competing perspectives side by side, it's like night and day. The Spanish saw colonization as a divine mission, right? Spread Catholicism and extract as much wealth, like gold and silver, as possible. The English, on the other hand, pointed at stories of Spanish brutality, which they called the Black Legend, just to claim that they were the good guys, the more humane colonizers. But the harsh reality for indigenous and African peoples? All European colonizers shared a total disregard for them. They had to endure invasion, horrific diseases like smallpox, and violent forced slavery. This massive clash of perspectives even spilled over into the environment itself. Europeans basically viewed nature as a commodity to be used. For example, because beaver-trimmed hats were a huge trend in Europe, colonists overhunted beavers literally to the brink of extinction in some areas, which totally destroyed local pond habitats. They also brought over free-ranging pigs that gobbled up all the food that native deer relied on. This severely disrupted the delicate ecological balance that Native Americans had maintained and relied upon for generations. And the reality of colonization was pretty brutal for the European settlers themselves, too. Take the English settlers in Jamestown, Virginia. They showed up hoping to just scoop gold right off the ground. Instead, they hit a devastating period known as the Starving Time, during the winter of 1609 to 1610. George Percy's primary source account from that time paints a grim picture of unimaginable desperation. They were so miserable and starving, they resorted to eating just about anything they could find. All right, let's get into Section 3, Agency and Active Resistance. We have to remember that Native Americans demonstrated incredible agency by fighting back on multiple fronts. In eastern North America, tribes engaged in mourning wars, taking captives to try and cope with the unbelievable population loss from those European diseases. Down in the Chesapeake Bay, the Powhatan Empire fought a series of intense wars to defend their territory from expanding English tobacco farms. And up in New England, native tribes launched King Philip's War to fiercely protect their sovereignty against Puritan expansion. We see that exact same powerful agency among enslaved Africans, brought to the Americas completely against their will to provide forced labor for cash crops like sugar and tobacco. They were never just passive victims. Despite facing horrendous conditions and the extreme violence meant to impose mastery, enslaved individuals showed profound agency. They actively resisted their enslavement at literally every single opportunity they could find.
and this pushback was happening all over the map. In the Carolinas, the Yamasee and Creek tribes actively fought back when English traders encroached on their lands, racked up unfair trade debts, and took native women as captives. Out west in Santa Fe, New Mexico, Pueblo villagers continually contested and resisted Spanish dominance. The big takeaway here? Marginalized groups continuously asserted their humanity, their agency, and their rights. They didn't just roll over.
Now for Section 4, Settlement, Empire, and Protest. Tracing this timeline is actually pretty fascinating. We kick off with fragile, struggling early settlements like Jamestown in 1607 and Santa Fe in 1610, but fast forward about a century and a half, and these American colonies have exploded in size. By 1768, you've got British troops occupying Boston, sparking massive local outrage, which basically creates a domino effect, leading straight to the drafting of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Time for our second pause check. The British Empire sent 4,000 troops to Boston in 1768, supposedly to keep the peace. So why did colonists, especially groups like the Sons of Liberty, protest so fiercely the second those boots hit the ground? Well, the immediate reasoning for all that anger was definitely multi-layered. First, those troops were a constant, highly visible reminder of unequal imperial power. Nobody likes that. Second, off-duty British soldiers actually moonlighted at the docks, meaning they were competing for scarce local civilian jobs. And third, having a massive military presence right there directly threatened the colonial smuggling operations that local merchants heavily relied on to dodge strict British taxes. So decades of this growing resistance and protesting against imperial reforms finally boils over in 1776. This ultimate act of pushback is captured perfectly in the famous opening lines of the Declaration of Independence. When you really look at it, it was essentially a formal, written document of protest, listing out all their grievances against the king's perceived tyranny and officially cutting those political bands with the British Empire. All right, last stop, Section 5, Recap and Final Transfer. If you take away anything from today's explainer, make it these 3 steps on how to truly think like a historian. Step 1, always separate biased primary claims like our friend Columbus and his Probanza de Merito from actual corroborated facts. Step 2, recognize the active agency and resistance of marginalized groups. They were fighting back, not just sitting on the sidelines. And step 3, analyze historical events through multiple competing perspectives. Remember, the Spanish, the English, and native populations experienced the exact same era in completely different ways. I'm going to leave you with a final thought to chew on. History isn't just stuck in the past, it's training for how we handle the present. When you're scrolling through a modern news article or reading some heavily debated social media post today, how can you apply these exact same historical skills? How will you separate a modern author's biased proof of merit from the actual corroborated truth? Definitely something to think about. Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer, 8th graders, and keep questioning the narrative.